This review is for a really gorgeous fantasy. I suppose you could call it mythic fantasy or some such. It's basically a fairy tale retelling, and as some of you know, I'm absolutely addicted to fairy tales ever since reading a few books about Jungian psychology and the effect of fairy tales on the psyche. Always liked reading fairy tales and kids' books and stuff, but I guess the Jungian psychology gave me an excuse and an explanation for why I liked it. So this book is The Book of 1,000 Days by Shannon Hale. This isn't the first Shannon Hale I've read. This one is from 2007, I believe, and I'm pretty sure it was nominated. Maybe it won some awards. The computer will probably tell me what they are. Yeah, Shannon Hale, text copyright 2007. Illustrations copyright James Noel Smith. And before I go any further, I'll just say that some of these illustrations are magnificent. They're simple ink and line drawings, but they are beautiful. They are absolutely lovely. And they give a very vivid, extra quality to this book. I don't think it really needed them, but it definitely made an added level of beauty to the narrative. Anyway, so Shannon Hale has excellent light touch with fairy tale retellings. She often chooses interesting stories. It isn't always Beauty and the Beast. Love Beauty and the Beast retellings, but Shannon Hale's The Goose Girl is one of my top favorite fairy tale fantasy retellings. And like that book, this manages to create the perfect balance between fairy tale, sometimes more than one fairy tale, a modern story, and a folklore type character and situation mixed with scenarios and attitudes that will appeal to the modern reader. It's quite exceptional. So The Book of 1,000 Days is published as young adult, so it's a YA book. And I have to say, when I first started reading it, it felt much younger than The Goose Girl, and I thought this is a really young adult. But you've got a lot of character development and a lot of writing development throughout. So actually it feels like the age in this part of the book is very different to the age in this part of the book. And considering it isn't a huge book, that's actually really impressive, and it's very well done. So, this book is actually based on a German fairy folk tale, which was originally recorded by the brothers Grimm, and the original Grimm brothers is called Maid Maleen. In that fairy tale, Maid Maleen falls in love with a prince, but her father will not let her marry him, and he locks up Maid Maleen and her maid servant in a tower for 7 years. I do think I've read this a long time ago. I don't remember it well. So the theme is carried into this book, but with differences. So instead of being in that tower for 7 years, they escape. The princess and the maid escape after only a couple of years. Since this is all first-person point of view of the maid, there. How can I have Dashti, the maid Dashti, and Princess Seven. Since it's all from the maid's point of view, the maid can write, and atypically the princess can't. The maid is a very force for movement, and the princess is very much a non-changing element. So the whole storytelling is quite different. I'm rather glad they didn't stay in the tower for 7 years, because no matter what you do, writing a diary for 7 years in a tower is going to wear thin eventually. So, like in the original Maid Maleen, once they've escaped the tower, they go back to the kingdom, and the entire kingdom is wrecked and devastated, and eventually they find their way to the kingdom of the prince who had been the Princess Seven's alleged betrothed, and for whose sake she had refused to marry another man that her father wanted her to marry. He's the bad guy, by the way, in case you had any doubts of that. He is an excellent bad guy. If you are going to create a villain, this guy has got all the qualities that a fairy tale villain needs. Perfect. Now, just an aside, the theme of the princess locked away in the tower is a very, very pervasive folklore and fairy tale. You get it quite aside from Rapunzel. Everyone's heard of Rapunzel, which is also a Grimm Brother collection. I think it was quite a high collection. You can number the Grimm Brother stories. I'm pretty sure that Rapunzel is 170 or so, quite high up the list. Anyway, it's also been used throughout Northern Europe. It's especially pervasive in Scandinavian folk tales, though in those ones often instead of a tower you get a mound, and the princess, sometimes with or without her maidservants, locked into the mound, but often again 7 years. So you've got all of those as well as the modern adaptations, and we've got plenty of modern adaptations of the Rapunzel or the Princess in the Tower type theme. Now, where Shannon's genius for fairy tales comes in here is in the first person point of view of the maid Dashti. The character of the maid is excellent, and because she's only just learned to read and write just before she gets locked in the tower, her evolution as a writer as well as a character is very steep learning curve, very steep evolution curve, and it's very interesting to follow. Now, the other thing about Dashti is she comes from a background that she calls Maka, which is basically a tribal on the land type background, and she only came to the city to be employed days before she's taken on as the princess's maid. The princess goes through a lot of maids, we're told, and when she first meets Dashti, she goes to her and makes her promise to always follow her. Within seconds after that, the king, is he a king? He's kind of a king, arrives and tells Dashti that what her promise means, if she keeps her vow, she's going to be locked in a tower for 7 years with this girl she's just met. But she does that. So there's very strong themes of loyalty, keeping one's vows and promises, and there's a theme of friendship under adversity that runs all the way through and takes a long time to develop, because Princess Seven is obviously suffering from a horrible shock to the reader, but within the book there seems to be something wrong with her. Right, so Dashti being our leading character instead of Princess Seren, gives it a complexity that will appeal to the modern reader, because it gives an excuse for a lot of the things she does. She's under vow to the princess, she's under service, she doesn't come from an elaborate background like a princess was. She's doing the best by her own standards from within her own social construct. So that gives it an extra fairy tale element to it. Now, on to the next bit. In my opinion, this is an absolute stroke of genius on the part of the author Shannon Hale. The cultural theme is a kingdom of 8 realms. So Princess Seven is from one. Seren is from one. Her and there's the tower that she gets locked up in. Her lover is from one side and the bad guy is on the other side. But this 8 kingdom world building is actually based around what the author calls a fictionalized version of medieval Mongolia. And this gives it a really strong fairy tale feel to the modern Western reader. Similar to that mindset that in traditional spoken word fairy tales would invoke, starting by "Once upon a time in a land far, far away lived a princess." That tells the listener, or later on the reader, what they're about to experience isn't here and now. It's in a place that's in the subconscious or far away, deep inside your brain. Now, again, sliding sideways into fairy stories rather than this book. As a culture, we've lost the understanding of the importance of long ago, far away for fairy tales beginning. We're too sophisticated to be able to understand the power of a story starting in the subconscious of a culture, and how important that can actually be both on the personal level and the cultural cohesion through storytelling level. And guys, I'm sorry, social media is not taking over that niche at all. It's just not. So, fairy tales and folk tales didn't start off as children's stories. They started off as cultural way of transmitting beliefs, good and bad, as a way of bonding a culture together further, reinforcing us and them. Not us and them is not such a great notion in the modern world. It's caused a lot of problems, but it is part of tribal cultures. And it is very noteworthy that every culture that has been examined, that I know at least, in this way, has a set introduction for stories, and the Western one has been documented, has been around in the 12th century already. So in a land far, far away, is that pervasive. Now, if you look at a few other cultures, and I looked up a couple, in Thai, folk stories and fairy tales start with once upon the time, which is the time being long ago. In Basque, once upon a time. Surprise. In Persian, someone was, someone wasn't. And that's, again, Armenian and a lot of those other Eastern cultures, I suppose. Not far, far east, Middle East, Mediterranean style. This someone was, someone wasn't. Somewhere it was, somewhere it wasn't. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. That's a very... does the word Occidental still mean anything? It's very common in a number of cultures. So, how does it go? Someone was, someone wasn't. Who you expect and what you expect them to be doing. It's a beautiful story. So Dashti is from basically a yak herder's background, and the helper animals that are in this book are very unlike the ones that you see in many other fairy tales, in that how many fairy tales do you actually know where it's a yak instead of, I don't know, a squirrel or something? There is also a friendly cat for those who are cat lovers. It is so nicely written. It is considered young adult, but and yeah, it's certainly suited for young adult, but I believe there's a complexity. Certainly at the end, when Dashti and Princess Saran have arrived at her lover's castle, the Khan's castle, that's him, though he's sick at the time, and the princess keeps insisting that Dashti represent herself as the princess, and Dashti knows that it's wrong, and she knows that she can be severely punished, even capital punishment, with doing this, but she's still stuck between obeying her own conscience, obeying her own desires, because by now she's in love with the Khan, and obeying what she's being told to do, which when she was younger, anything that she was told to do by a noble was something that she had to do. She's got a real complexity of choices to make. At the complexity level, it becomes more modern and less fairy tale. Fairy tales tend to have very simple yes or no, and all of the Princess in the Tower and the Kitchen Maid Princess type stories tend to have very, very straightforward and rather simplistic notions of good, what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Shannon Hale never goes as far as I can tell for the simplistic. She always makes them more complex and more elaborate. Now, one other thing about Dashti is that she's got songs that are common in her yak herder background, which she calls Maka. But these songs are like spells. They enable her to sing health. They're not a Deus Ex Machina. They don't solve everything, but singing a song for health is going to make someone who wants to recover healthier. Singing a song for sleep is going to make someone relax. And that this singing ability of hers is very much a narrative throughout the plot. One last word. I really like that at the end of the book, Shannon Hale mentions that through the research for this book, the author was led to working with Heifer International, which is a global non-profit organisation responsible for helping to get domestic animals to family and third world countries. Apparently, as she was researching it, she realised just how much of a difference one single animal will make in subsistence living to a family, the difference between life and death. Anyway, that's a serious note. This is a beautiful book. If you like fairy tales, mythic fantasy, I think you should read it. I think you'll enjoy it. There is a magical realism element to this that is both naive and complex, and it is quite beautiful. Like, comment and subscribe. Especially comment if you've read it. I don't actually know anyone else who's read this book. I'm sure they're out there. It won awards.